can I just say how delighted I am that over 100 of us, nearly 200 at the moment, from what I can see, have given up our time on Saturday morning, and not just given up, but actually, should I just say, intentionally chose to be here on a Saturday to spend time together at this conference, this safeguarding conference. I want to help us to keep the time, so I shall say what I'm going to say so that you are back on for 9:30 as well, and continue with the program as is. I was in 1998, 98, a delegate to the World Council of Churches meeting. And as part of that meeting, there was a pre-meeting for women. And in that pre-meeting of women, I will always remember a woman from South America who spoke about the life of abuse that she had experienced. But what was more difficult as another woman sitting listening wasn't so much that she had received all this abuse, and this was abuse within the home, first and foremost, abuse within the home by her husband. But what was hard to listen to was the numerous times that she had been to her priest, and it just so happened to have been a Roman Catholic priest, but it could have been any priest. The fact of the matter is that she had gone to her priest, battered, bruised, and spoken, shared the abuse that was happening within the home. And each time her priest would basically quote her scriptures about the sanctity of marriage and sent her back home into that abuse. There weren't many of us at that conference who were dried-eyed as she cataloged the kind of abuse that she endured. And I think as I said, what was hardest was that the church, in effect, had condoned that abuse in the name of using religious, scriptural language as to why she should remain in that marriage. I was deeply disturbed by that. And in that conference, we left with these words, your story is my story, and my story is your story. And what I personally got from that was, how do we stand in each other's shoe? How do we try to listen? Not to be ready with some passage of scripture to start shooting out about what the sanctity of marriage means. But how do we genuinely listen to one another's story? And how do we enable each other to be restored from those experiences? Your story is my story, and my story is your story. I hope that, like me, as you do your safeguarding training, the different forms of training, that you will be refreshed, as it were, reminded of the different types of abuse that exist in our world that we inhabit today. Yes, not just domestic abuse, but there is physical abuse, there is sexual abuse, neglect, financial abuse, coercive control, there is spiritual abuse, there is discriminatory abuse, there is institutional abuse, emotional abuse, and the list goes on. If we are being made aware of these types of abuse that exist, then the challenge is up to us. The challenge is there for us as leaders. And you might say, oh, I'm just a member of a congregation, What do you mean about leaders? I want to say that we're all leaders as the people of God in different forms, in different ways, especially if you have a safeguarding responsibility. How do we recognize these kinds of abuse when we hear people telling their story? But also, perhaps we need to step back and ask, do we provide the kind of environment that enables someone to tell their story without thinking that they're going to be sniggered at, they're going to be looked at with, really? Did that happen? I can't believe it. How do we provide the environment for people to be able to share their story of abuse? And then for us to ensure that we are regularly equipped so that we can respond in a way that is most appropriate. I'm really pleased that I renewed my safeguarding training quite recently, because one of the things that I've heard clergy and lay saying was, oh, this is just too much, I can't deal with this. And they've also said to me, I have found it too disturbing. Why are we being subjected to this? And I hear myself saying, my God, this is not happening to you. And you are saying you found it too disturbing and wanting to get away from it. Much more so the person for whom this is real. So I guess I want to say to us, be disturbed. Be disturbed. Do not run away from the fact that what you have heard is disturbing. But then we must ask ourselves, from the point of being disturbed, what next? What do we do with what we have just heard? Have we recognized what we have heard? How do we respond? How do we record what we have heard? And how do we refer on what we have heard to ensure that something is done about it? There's a wonderful passage of scripture. I have lots, but there's one particular one that I hold dear to my heart. And it's from John's Gospel. I am come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. I am come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. Abuse does not give for abundant life. And so as the people of God, anything that takes away that abundance of a life that is flourishing and well lived has got to be contrary to that which God expects, has got to be contrary to what is being expected as our churches, the environment in which we move in, schools, communities, being safe places for others to be. So I guess as I draw to a close, I just want to encourage us all today to listen well to what is being shared. But then I want us to intentionally take from today all that we need that is going to equip us to go out and ensure that the communities of which we are a part, whether it be church or home or community centers or community projects, that they are indeed safe places for children, young people, those who are most vulnerable, for all in effect. From the moment they come into those spaces, it is our responsibility to ensure that they are in a safe environment. And let us not hide behind cultural barriers. Let us seek to understand what is happening culturally, because we cannot excuse behaviors. It really is important that we seek to ensure that together we're in a safe environment where all can flourish, where all can have abundant life. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Rose. Would you pray for us just before we start? That would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Heavenly Father, you came and dwelt among us. You became vulnerable and needed to be cared for, needed to be protected, needed to be loved. And we thank you for modeling that in our presence. So teach us, Lord. Teach us to create the kind of environment that will enable others, especially children, young people, and those most vulnerable, to flourish and grow, to be nurtured in your love. So bless us now. I pray especially for all those who will be contributing into today's session, and for all who are online receiving, that this may be a time of intentional learning, so that together we can do our part to ensure that the abundant life that you came to give is received by all. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I am going to spotlight Paul Brightwell, who is our first speaker this morning. Off you go, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend this conference. One of the things that I have been keen to do over this and last year's Safeguarding Conference is present on aspects of safeguarding that are not usually discussed, but provide some insights into why errors in safeguarding can happen. Last year, I spoke about the psychology of misjudgment and how the way that our brain processes sensory information can sometimes lead us to making mistakes. This presentation is about creativity and understanding its place in safeguarding. Creativity in safeguarding is important. It has the potential to improve the effectiveness of practice in areas such as assessment, interpreting legislation, communication, partnership working, mediation, identifying and obtaining scarce resources, and the development of new services. There is also much potential for how computer technologies can be utilised to increase the efficiency of services and empower those being supported. This presentation is my attempt to creatively explain the creative process within a safeguarding context and understand how we can be more creative in the way we work. Before we take a more detailed look, I first want to focus on two high-profile cases that have happened during the COVID pandemic. I appreciate that these cases are upsetting to hear, so for those of you who would rather not listen to this part of my presentation, feel free to turn down your volume button for a couple of minutes until I turn to my next slide. On the 16th of June 2020, Arthur was severely beaten by his stepmother, Emma Tuston, causing what was described as an unsurvivable brain injury. This poor child was subject to repeated physical abuse and neglect over many weeks and months. The impact of social distancing and school closures will have made the job of child protection professionals harder, but nonetheless, at least some concerns were reported to social workers and the police by family members, including sending photos of Arthur with bruises to his body. Tustin and Hughes were found guilty of murder and of manslaughter by Coventry Crown Court on the 4th of December 2021. Tustin was given a 29-year prison sentence and Hughes 21 years. National and local government advice to social workers and other safeguarding professionals during the initial wave of the pandemic was to minimise direct contact and, where possible, not go into family homes and to undertake visits on the doorstep or outside. This significantly impacted on the ability of social workers to get close to children, and in addition, many other professionals and agencies who would normally also be eyes and ears in seeing vulnerable children, such as health visitors, early help and therapeutic services, stopped visiting and went online. This allowed parents, like Arthur's, to be able to deliberately manipulate child protection professionals and hide their abuse of Arthur. A local review was launched into the incident soon after Arthur's death, and subsequently the government announced that there would be a national inquiry into the case. We await its findings. A similar pattern of circumstances and errors occurred with Star Hobson, a 16-month-old baby girl who suffered a cardiac arrest and died in hospital in West Yorkshire on the 22nd of September 2020. Star had been repeatedly assaulted by her mother's partner, Savannah Brockhill, for months on end. Brockhill was found guilty of Star's murder and jailed for life. Star's mother, Frankie Smith, was given 8 years for causing or allowing her death. There were 5 referrals to Bradford Council before baby Star was murdered. A few days ago, Bradford Council was stripped of their children's services, which is to be taken over by a trust to drive through rapid improvements. It's likely that factors that led to poor practice in both children's cases were due to endemic issues about the management and culture in how children's services were run in these councils, and which existed well before the pandemic. Nevertheless, the similar pattern of concerns in both cases do raise valid questions about the impact of the pandemic on the welfare of vulnerable children. Statistics for England show that there had been a 20% decrease in referrals to local authorities' children's departments during the pandemic, but a 20% increase in reported cases of child harm and a 19% increase in child deaths. Anne Longfield, the former Children's Commissioner for England, said that a lot of the services went onto the screens for children, and it's much easier for families who want to evade view to do that when they haven't got someone in the room. So there's a big lesson here, instantly, about if there is a crisis, there are children who are going to slip from view, and we have to make sure they have the protection, which does need face-to-face contact. If ever there was a time for more creativity in safeguarding, I cannot think of a moment more in need than now. So how creative is safeguarding? Let's look at some of the evidence. The first comes from research by Garrison, published in 1986, which I read shortly after qualifying as a social worker in 1992. It is one of the few pieces of research in social work directly focusing on creativity, and it is what initially directed my interest in this area. The research measured the creativity scores of social work students as they progressed through the final year of their social work training. To my astonishment and concern, it found that their creativity scores reduced over this time period, unlike many other students in other professions whose creativity increased. The impact of academic demands on student social workers, combined with the emotional impact from undertaking social work placements at the same time, was considered the main reason for this finding, and Garrison recommended that social workers should receive specific training on problem solving. Given the complexity of the problems that are presented in a safeguarding context, that recommendation made a lot of sense. But 35 years later, it still hasn't happened. More recently, 2 articles have been published that refer to the creativity of safeguarding professionals during the pandemic. One being a research in practice bulletin on child protection, and the other a community care article focusing on adult safeguarding. Both articles focus on reactionary forms of creativity, mainly improvisation. This includes things like seeing children, parents and vulnerable adults out of the home, using different media, going for walks, spreading out contact shorter and more often. Are these really examples of creativity? Central and local government advice to social workers and other safeguarding professionals was to maintain social distancing and see people outside wherever possible. Everyone was going online, even our pets. Rather than being creative, these examples are, in my opinion, representative of conventional practice given the context and challenges of the pandemic. In addition, as we have mentioned, a contributory factor in the deaths of both Arthur and Star were failures to maintain regular face-to-face contact. Yet there was an absence in directing creative energy to address this key area of vulnerability. What is also apparent is a failure in both articles to properly conceptualize what is meant by creativity. The evidence is worrying. Not only are social workers and other safeguarding professionals likely to be hampered in being creative due to a range of pressures, academics in safeguarding who drive new ideas in policy and practice seem to show a lack of interest in and poor understanding of how to conceptualize creativity and identify it when it happens. The first thing we need is a clear definition of what creativity is and isn't. In its basic terms, there are 3 core requirements for something to be seen as creative. It must be novel, appropriate to the task at hand, and happen within a social exchange. When you apply this definition to an area like safeguarding, there are also a number of additional constraints that we need to be mindful of. These are the main ones. So let's test this definition out by examining a potential idea for safeguarding children and vulnerable adults. This is my all-time favorite contender for the most creative idea in safeguarding, a can of Stop It. Stay with me on this. The problem with this idea, of course, is that while it is original as an idea, it's not that effective unless we can invent something to put in the can that actually works. The nearest we seem to have got so far is WD-40, and I would not recommend spraying that on anyone. So at least for now, it fails to meet the second core criteria in our definition. The other difficulty with it, even if we could invent something that worked, is what if it got into the hands of perpetrators? They could use it to stop us using it on them. So it also fails the must do no harm criteria. Spraying people with anything to stop them doing something you don't like also goes beyond social convention, so it's not really social work either. Oh well, back to the drawing board. What I want to do now is spend some time introducing you to the key components of creative thinking. This is going to be a whirlwind tour of a number of quite complex factors involved in the creative process, and to which I have added my own creativity to describe. To help you understand the full complexity of the creative process, this is a flow diagram I developed to show how all the factors that I have identified work together. Any conspiracy theorist in the room might be mistaken for believing this is a circuit diagram for a COVID vaccine, it isn't really. To explain what is being shown in this diagram, I want you to imagine creativity being represented as a house, with each room reflecting a different aspect of the creative process. This is what a house of creativity and safeguarding might look like. Let's now take a tour through each of these rooms. The room of creative thinking contains all the architecture of the human mind that is believed to be associated with the thought processes involved in creative thinking. There are three factors in particular that are important in influencing the emergence of creative ideas: attention, logical versus intuitive thinking, and memory. Within this room, you would also come across a number of characters, each of which represents a different aspect of how creativity is expressed. Magicians represent improvisation. It is arguably the most basic of the ways creativity is expressed and is usually short-lived. You find this type of creativity in safeguarding in frontline intake teams. Quality cabinet makers demonstrate technical creativity, which you find more frequently in long-term teams. Stradivarius is also a good example of how this type of creativity is demonstrated. Resource tinkerers are the inventors. Interestingly, research suggests that this group of creative individuals are more likely to have differing childhood experiences than those who demonstrate other forms of creativity, including being more likely to have experienced the death of a parent. Innovators can be seen to steal ideas from the creative rich and utilize them to develop new ways of working. In a safeguarding context, the idea that they then give their innovations to help the vulnerable in the form of new services makes their Robin Hood status quite an apt one. There is debate, though, about whether innovators are a genuine type of creativity or whether they represent a slightly different branch. A key difference is that creativity is usually driven by intrinsic motivators, whereas innovation is influenced by extrinsic concerns. One of the things that you see if you track the available research in social work is how the use of the term creativity completely vanishes following the arrival of the new Labour government in the late 90s and is replaced with the term innovation. New Labour's emphasis on bringing in a business culture into safeguarding is likely to have been a major influence here, moving creative energies from intrinsic concerns to extrinsic motives. Lastly, we have the wise wizards, who are the generators of creative ideas. It is difficult to spot this aspect of creativity in safeguarding. It doesn't happen very often, and when it does happen, it is usually someone who has come from outside those professions that usually lead on safeguarding. John Bowlby, whose work led to the development of attachment theory, is arguably one of the best examples of a wise wizard in this area of work. These characters of creative expression are contrasted by two that represent the opposite of creativity. First, we have the groupies, which represent conventional, tried and tested practice. This is what most of us are most of the time. There is nothing wrong with that, by the way. Groupies are cool, unless you're a penguin. The other non-creative character is the one you really don't want to be, especially in a safeguarding context. These are the robots. David Howe described the presence of this character well in social work. So how are these different characters of creative and non-creative expression demonstrated in the delivery of safeguarding practice? This is a table that I have produced to try to show this. It uses 3 different levels of practice ranging from everyday to expert and eminent, and shows for each which types of creativity and non-creative forms of practice can be demonstrated. One of the key messages that this table shows is the importance of expert levels of practice in safeguarding. It is this level which gives the greatest opportunity to deliver creativity in all its forms and maintain best practice. Expertise, though, lives in another room in this house, so let's park this for now and move into the next room. The room of task motivation contains the energy that is used to kickstart the other elements of the creative process into action. Motivation can encourage or stifle creativity. It depends on where the motivation is coming from. The room of knowledge and expertise represents the house's library and study. Knowledge by itself is a double-edged sword. Too little or too much knowledge can hamper someone's ability to be creative. Expertise, on the other hand, appears to be exponential in increasing our potential to be creative. In general terms, it takes around 10,000 hours of work in a given area, around 10 years, to achieve expertise. There is a range, though. Poets seem to need about half this time, and orchestral conductors more, around 12,000 hours. Becoming an expert in one area can also give someone skills that can be transferable to other areas, and it's not unusual to find people becoming creative in an area of work that they have moved into. This is likely to be because they bring new ideas and ways of solving a problem, along with a set of general skills that allow them to put their ideas into practice. In relation to safeguarding, Eileen Munro put forward a number of ways in which expertise can be developed. The room of individual differences recognises the influence that each person's qualities and attributes has on the creative process, and how creativity will be demonstrated by them. The way individual differences work, whether this be age, gender, personality, intelligence, etc., is subtle, and in many respects only becomes apparent when comparing lots of people and analysing results statistically. There is a great deal of overlap, and in many ways we all have much more in common with each other, but nevertheless, subtle differences do contribute to how each of us demonstrates our creativity and how often. One optical illusion that shows gender differences is called Checker's shadow. The image depicts a checkerboard with light and dark squares partly shadowed by another object and with two dots. The optical illusion is that the dot behind the object appears to be lighter than the dot above it. However, within the context of the two-dimensional image, they are of identical brightness. Research by Dinov in 2011 suggests that females are statistically more likely to see this illusion than males, primarily because males are more than twice as likely to suffer from colour blindness. The same illusion presented with no colour is here. One area where there are marked differences in creativity is age. The ability to maintain asking childlike, inquisitive questions into adulthood that are not bound by convention, while having the intellectual capacity to begin to answer those questions, seems to be a powerful quality that some of the most creative people in history have had. The way we go about solving problems can also have a big influence on the way we demonstrate creativity. Curtin's theory of adapters and innovators is one very useful way of explaining this. In simple terms, adapters tend to solve problems within existing systems that set out how they should operate, whereas innovators work within more than one system and can be seen to be more out of the box in how they think and solve problems. Both types of problem solvers can be equally creative. The issue is how they demonstrate their creativity. The theory also suggests that the way that people with these different approaches to problem solving react to extrinsic motivators, which can stifle creativity, differs when trying to solve complex problems, with adapters being more influenced detrimentally than innovators. The first problem this presents with regard to safeguarding is that what we are dealing with are mainly very complex problems, so any factors that might get in the way of someone's ability to solve a problem is a problem. It also doesn't help that the environment that most safeguarding professionals work in, the public sector, is bombarded with a range of extrinsic motivators, such as performance targets and an evaluation culture, inspections, that can all stifle creativity. Perhaps most safeguarding professionals are innovative in their problem-solving style, and this isn't therefore such a big problem. Hayward and Everett's longitudinal research would suggest otherwise. I should say that there is nothing wrong being an adapter. While we need innovators at times when change is happening, they really don't work at their best when things are going smoothly, and can find adapters irritating and can be seen to adapters as a bit odd. I will leave you all to decide whether this man is an adapter or an innovator. If you're interested in measuring your own creativity, these two inventories might be useful to you. They are both free to use and don't require any special training. The room of social influence reflects the role played by social and organizational factors, such as teams and leadership, on the ability of people to be creative and what is considered to be creative by others. Some of the ways that an organization's culture can influence creativity is represented by some more characters in my framework. First, we have the friendly giants. These are your organizational friends. You really don't want any of these in your organization, but it's helpful to know what to look for in case you do. Conjurers represent the way creativity can be expressed by policymakers. They can be either friendly giants or assassins. Magpies represent the importance of rhetoric in the creative process. Another aspect of how social influence can affect people's ability to think creatively are called cultural blocks. A fairly well-known example of a cultural block is the 9-dot problem, where the task involves connecting all the dots using only 4 straight lines while not lifting the pen from the paper. Many of you may well be familiar with this problem and already know the answer. Here it is. So if that was too easy, how about completing the task with only 3 straight lines? How about using only 1? The cultural block to solving this problem occurs through a desire to conform to an adopted pattern that the dots can represent, a square box. This makes it difficult to think outside of the confines of the box to find an effective solution to the problem. Another example of a cultural block is shown here. The 13 becomes a B when reading the letters. So how can an understanding of creativity help protect vulnerable children and adults at risk? Well, for a start, being more creative gives us more opportunities to solve the complex problems that we are faced with in safeguarding. Creativity is not a tap, though, that you can turn on or off, so the best we can hope for in safeguarding is that we provide an environment where creative ideas can flourish and professionals understand when to use them in their work and when tried and tested ways of working to safeguard and protect vulnerable people is best. We can do some things to help make this happen. We can establish expert teams and develop a clear and shared vision of the goals we want our team to achieve, but welcomes new ideas and solutions. As leaders, we can become a strong role model for the beliefs and values that we want other team members to adopt. We need to recognise the value and importance of conventional, tried and tested ways of working, like the importance of face-to-face contact, and to focus our creativity in how we do this at times when this is harder, like during the pandemic. We must also be very careful in how we use extrinsic motivators, especially things like performance targets, evaluation and rewards. They will often stifle creativity and could end up turning us all into robots. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope it was interesting and useful. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Paul. If you want to stop sharing your slides, that'd be great. Bring us back. And then, so what we're going to do now is Paul has got an exercise for us to work through, but I don't know about you. I mean, I found that really fascinating and interesting, and it'd be good to chat in your breakout rooms about any things that have come up. I know somebody's asked about whether the links, Paul, for the creativity could be made available within the chat. So if you wouldn't mind copying and pasting that in, that'd be great. And he's going to set us, so Paul's going to set us a breakout room task. So we're going to go back into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. However, I'm highly aware of my own bladder. So I'm sure others of us are feeling quite aware of our own bladders at the same time. So if you want to take this opportunity to refresh your drink, to go to the loo if you need to. So we'll open the breakout rooms. We'll give you about, well, we'll close them after 10 minutes and bring you back in. So if you can, Paul, do you want to share the breakout task while I sort out the breakout rooms?
Will do. I'm just going to go back into my slides. Right, here we go. This is called the product improvement task. So the task at hand is think of as many unusual ways that the toy dog can be changed to make it more fun and enjoyable for children to play with. You score 1 point for each unusual suggestion that you make, and usual suggestions, which I shall show to you later after you've done the task, score no points.
So that's your task. That's your toy dog. I'm sure you don't need it there. So I'm going to pop you into rooms now. As I said, we'll open the rooms for 10 minutes and bring you back after 10. If you can bring your creative ways of how you're going to make the dog more interesting and fun for children to play with, that'd be great. Paul has got a score sheet for us to score ourselves, and we can put our scores into the chat, so you score as your room. I mean, you can just let us know. There's no prizes though. so there's no prizes for the most creative, other than the joy and satisfaction of knowing you've been the most creative. So I'll pop you into your rooms now. We'll see you all in 10 minutes. So just a couple of, this won't take long, but just a couple of updates from around safeguarding within the Church of England and from our respective dioceses. There is, you will have been aware of the work that has been undertaken for the Past Cases Review 2 that was taking place across the Church of England, and that, well, I mean, across the whole of the Church of England, that will have looked at tens of thousands of files. Within Rochester and Canterbury, you're looking at several thousand of files, which includes all members of living clergy, whether they are active or non-active, volunteers, diocesan staff where they met the criteria. So it was a comprehensive inspection from independent reviewers who were brought in from the outside of every diocese and from outside the Church of England to review the files, looking for whether dioceses and the Church of England had acted appropriately with any safeguarding concerns that might have been raised, both currently or historically. At the moment, there are no plans for any diocese to publish their local reports. There is an internal report that goes to each diocese with its findings and recommendations, and the diocesan safeguarding advisory panels for each of those, for every diocese across the country, is holding the diocese, respective dioceses, accountable for implementing the recommendations. So just to answer the question, or maybe preempt the question, what happens with the recommendations, who holds the diocese to account? It's the independent advisory panels that do that, and those are chaired by independent chairs. But all of that information and all the data is going into a national report for the Church of England on the past cases review too, and that will be out sometime in the spring, and it will come with some national recommendations that dioceses will be expected, and the Church of England nationally will be expected to implement. I won't speak to Rochester. In fact, I don't know what Rochester is contained, but I will speak to Canterbury to reassure folks that the themes that were arising for Canterbury were in line with themes that were arising nationally. So, and also just to reassure that for Canterbury, there were no cases that were found to be anyone at risk right now. So no one was left at risk as a result of actions taken or not taken. So, which was good. It was a good finding generally there. Greg, I don't know if you want to say anything specifically about your PUCR2 without giving away state secrets, but
there are no state secrets. We, as many will know, were one of 7 dioceses that actually had to go back and do PCR, so past case review 1 as well as 2. So it was a bigger piece of work, and like Canterbury, there were no significant cases. There was only one case identified that we had to refer to the statutory agencies, which had been referred all properly internally before, but it actually should have been reported to the police. Yes, we've had probably more to learn, because obviously ours was over a wider period, and we wait to see the national. But there were no surprises, I think, fortunately, and because we have now invested in more staff, more technology, a lot of the issues that were identified had already been addressed, which I think is a positive, and I understand that will be the same for Canterbury, that we had identified as teams, and the diocesan leadership teams had identified gaps before, so there were no big surprises, which is always good. So we wait to see what the national report says. Although Fiona is ever the optimist, she said it's going to be published in the spring. Depends when spring ends.
And I'm going with the very latest, which is summer equinox, which is the 21st of June. So sometime between now and the summer.
See, you learn something new every day. So yes, I would think I put money, not that I'm a betting man, on summer. So
there we go.
But we are very grateful that parishes submitted all their detailed returns, and we had full cooperation from parishes and individuals, which I think is a real positive.
Yeah, and I'd echo that from Canterbury as well. Actually, it was when the parish returns, I know that felt quite daunting, and it has felt like it's gone on for quite some time because of the pandemic in the middle. So so thank you very much for everybody's cooperation. So just to mention a couple of policy updates from the national team. One is, you'll be aware, hopefully, from the various newsletters and briefings that go out, is that the safer recruitment policy changed, and the implementation date for that was the beginning of January this year. The most significant change is part of that policy. Well, there's several changes, but the couple that I'd like to highlight is that the DBS checks have moved from every 5 years to every 3 years, and that is now in line with best practice across the voluntary sector. Most other voluntary organisations, it would have been every 3 years as well. There is a 2-year catch-up programme for that. So you need to ensure that everybody is on a 3-year cycle by the end of 2023. So don't panic, you've got some time to do that. And if you've got any questions in Canterbury, I'd like to refer you to our DBS expert, Caroline Evans, who's our administrator. Where would they go in Rochester, Greg, for some advice on DBS?
So Caroline Smith, one of the DSAs, leads for DBS, and Alison, our administrator. Yes, the same from Fiona, and as many will know in Rochester, I go, don't ask me about DBS. I'll answer on many other things, but DBS is not my specialist area. Yes, so Caroline and Alison from our end, please.
Thank you. And the other thing just on that particular policy of safer recruitment is ensuring that where you are, so don't panic around existing projects and existing volunteers, but if you are recruiting or setting up a new project or recruiting new volunteers, we would suggest that you use a volunteer application form and do take up references, even if you've known somebody for 30 years. It's just best practice. But if you need to have a conversation with us about it because you're worried about it, please do. And I will later on just show you my screen, but there is some online, so not Zoom training, but online training that you can go through around for that safer recruitment process and how to do that. And you can just access that independently. I think it takes about an hour to go through at a maximum. And we would recommend anybody who's recruiting for any post, including volunteers, just goes through that training. I think, Greg, over to you for the next couple of bits, and then I'll come back at the end.
Thanks, Fiona. As you're probably aware, all of the new policies are now part of the Safeguarding e-manual hosted by the National Church, which hopefully is going to make life easier, because you can then search and find the bit of policy, because as you know, the policies and guidance are quite complex and not always easy to navigate. So hopefully that's a positive. We have been reassured that the issue that the National Church had over being able to download the whole of the document into a PDF has now been resolved, because I know some of you, me included, like to have a hard copy that I can annotate and refer to quickly rather than trying to navigate online. So I would encourage you to use the whole of the Safeguarding e-manual as it's developed, which hopefully, as I say, will make life easier. As always, the church is going through a period of change in regards to policy. Some of that has been as a result of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and reviews that the church have held, both sort of internally and then independently. So apologies, there is more policy changes coming, and that will be the case, I anticipate, for the next couple of years. The good thing is that the training guidance we now have in writing will not change for 3 years, and I'm sure you and others will all go, hurrah, they've made their mind up. Irrespective of whether we agree with the guidance or not, it's not going to change. So I think that's a real positive. And likewise, each document will now have a review. So the ones that are coming down the track, they have been published and they are on the e-manual. So I would encourage you to read them. Are the Responding Well to Victims and Survivors of Abuse, which comes in on the 4th of April. No real surprises there. It reflects much of the existing guidance. The only two significant parts, which are updates in my view, there is far more focus on individual church bodies, so parochial church councils, cathedrals, religious communities needs to provide on their website more details of how they can how a victim survivor can seek support and actually have local organisations available. I think we, and I speak on behalf of Rochester, we're very good at having all the national helplines. We're probably not as good as actually having local resources. So, you know, for instance, I'm aware there is a counselling service in, it's called the Tunbridge Counselling Service, but it is a Christian-based counselling service. Not everyone will know that, and that's, you know, a good resource that locally we would encourage churches to put up. So I see a question in the chat about will we be told if it changes? That's a good point, which we have raised with the national team. They will not always tell us, which is a bit of a flaw, that there have been slight changes. They will tell us of significant changes, but that is a piece of work in progress about how we communicate that, about the changes. But we would certainly, if there were significant ones, be telling you. There may be, as in the safe recruitment guidance, there's been quite a lot of changes and updates over the DBS and to some of the checklists. So it's more of the good practice guidance, suggested templates that will be changed. The main document cannot be changed because that has been approved by the House of Bishops. So there will only be some tweaking on the e-manual. But again, use the e-manual because it will be the latest, obviously, version, which I know I've had an exchange over this last week where someone was using the old training guidance, and we got very confused because I was reading page 17 and they were reading page 17 in a totally different one. So thanks, Jeremy. That's a good one. We will be asking to local churches to provide us with a list of local agencies in Rochester so that we can spread that as well. So we will be coming to you to say, you know, do you know of any local agencies that do specific support? The other main part in that piece of guidance is already in the managing allegations guidance, is actually the requirement to have support persons if there is an allegation or a concern, and there is now national training for a support person. Yes, it's another demand, so it might not be something that everybody wants to do, but we are looking, each diocese is doing this slightly differently. And if you are interested in becoming a support person, please look at the guidance or contact us in the diocese. So Caroline in the team is leading for that. So that is again a requirement. There needs to be a link person for the person who is subject to the allegation. And again, that is sort of being developed. So they're the two ones, main updates in the Responding Well guidance. The other guidance which comes in later in July is and it's a little confusing title, and apologies, I have asked the national team, I don't know why they've called it this, is Children, Young Persons and Vulnerable Adults Safeguarding Policy, which is an overview of safeguarding. So it has lots of definitions in it about what is safeguarding, the different types of abuse, but it also contains 3 significant sections, a short one on deliverance ministry, a slightly longer one on domestic abuse, and then the longest section is on spiritual abuse, which, as you will be well aware, is still being debated about what is spiritual abuse. But this is the first time that the Church of England has actually published some guidance on this. DSAs, so safeguarding advisors and bishops, are about to be trained on spiritual abuse. There is no national course yet to be available for the wider community, but I think that's something that's being considered. So I would encourage you again to read that part of the guidance, in particular the section on spiritual abuse. Thanks, Fiona.
Great, thanks, Greg. And the last thing that we would want to highlight to you, or I want to highlight to you, and in particular, given that the next session we're going to hear from Lisa Thompson is on domestic abuse, is the domestic abuse online training, which is available to anyone, which is hosted on the Church of England's training page. So the way you get to that is if you Google Church of England, I'll pop the link into the chat, but if you Google, if you missed the link, just Google Church of England online training portal. If you haven't got an account, just create an account. You just need to indicate which parish you're linked to. That will create a free account for you to access things like the basic awareness training for safeguarding, foundations training for safeguarding. We would recommend actually, if you're in this conference, please do both of those. That you're more than welcome to do them, and let us know. You keep hold of your certificate. We would recommend you repeat that every 3 years. But also what is new on there is domestic abuse online training for the Church of England. All members of the PCCs, and if you are in any role at all in your church, and I would say actually whether it involves vulnerable adults, children, young people, whatever, do the domestic abuse online training. Again, they don't take too long, and you'll be issued a certificate at the end, but critically, all PCC members should be doing this every 3 years. So if you're the parish safeguarding officer for your parish, please can you highlight that for your PCC? We can support you. Katie, our trainer, can support you in terms of how to access it, how to print the certificates. We know sometimes technology can be a barrier. I think there's been requests over people doing them all together. We can maybe look at that, but the module is set up so that people just do it as an individual and do it on their own and work their way through the module. So that is there. I will pop actually, I'll just share my screen very quickly so you can have a look and see what it is, what it looks like. So hopefully you'll be able to ignore my bits there. So you can see here, this is the module here, online training. That's the one. If you click on it, this is because I've logged in, and this is what it comes up with, and then you would enter the course, and it says 1.5 hours to 2 hours. It's probably more like an hour, I would suggest. Okay, so without further I'll pop the link for that while we're listening to the next session from Dr. Lisa Thompson. She does a great job of introducing herself at the beginning, so I won't do that. If you have any questions, I'm not sure if we said it at the beginning, but please do pop them into the chat. We'll try and answer them as best we can, or answer themes. And yeah, without any further hesitation, I'm going to share my screen so you can see Lisa.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Thompson, and I'm going to speak to you today about domestic violence and abuse. Just share my screen. First of all, a little bit about myself. I hold a PhD in law, specialising in victims of domestic abuse, effects of domestic abuse, and their victim and survivors' engagement in child protection systems with police, and also within the family court settings. Until August 2021, I ran a domestic abuse charity called Satida, and I was actually at the last in-person conference at Canterbury a few years ago prior to COVID, so some of you may have heard from me before. For those of you who haven't heard from me before, I need to assure everybody, remind everybody that some of the matters that I will be talking about today are of a very upsetting nature. Domestic violence and abuse is something that it pervades all elements of a victim's life, and there isn't anything about it that we can talk about without it being potentially upsetting. Not just violence, but emotional abuse and the far-reaching effects of coercive control, as we'll talk about in a moment. So some of you may be touched by this. If you are, then I will be providing details of domestic abuse services in Kent later on in my talk. Please do reach out and ask for help from the specialist services that are available in all of the areas across Kent. Another matter that I need to raise before I start is the one of gender. I am a practitioner. Obviously, I haven't worked within domestic abuse services since the summer, but I still class myself as a practitioner of domestic abuse services and a specialist. And I've always worked predominantly with female survivors. So all of my examples and case studies come from my experience of working with survivors that are female. This is not to take away the fact that men can be victims of domestic abuse and also women can be perpetrators of domestic abuse. We do have to remember that the vast majority of perpetrators are male and the vast majority of victims are female. However, if I do slip into gendered language in my presentation, then that is only because of my experience of working within the women's sector. So the learning objectives for today are very simple. I would hope that you will end this session with the ability to recognise domestic violence and abuse, and also to have knowledge of support services that are available for victims and survivors around the Kent area, should you need to refer anybody or advise anybody or even maybe seek help for yourself. So let's start with the very basics, the definition of domestic abuse, and this is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or who have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. The abuse can encompass but is not limited to psychological, physical, sexual, financial and emotional. And I'll be going over those later on. So what is controlling behaviour? So the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, have given us this definition, and that is a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. And a little bit of law now. So the Coercive and Controlling Behaviour Law that came in 2015 through the Serious Crime Act has this following definition, and the elements in red are the elements that require evidence in order for there to be a charge. A person A commits an offence if they are repeatedly or continuously engaged in behaviour towards another person. So first of all, it's not one single incident. It's not a couple of incidents. This is a controlling, a continuous and repeatedly level of control over time. So day and night, regardless. This is not the odd argument. This is a continuous behaviour that happens all the time. And at the time of the behaviour, both parties are personally connected. There are definitions of personal connection that I won't go into today because of time, but broadly, this coercive and controlling behaviour crime is relevant for those who are living as a couple or are a couple but don't live together. It's not for people that are no longer couples and have separated. For that, there are already stalking and harassment laws and other laws that can be used. So moving on to the next section, the behaviour has a serious effect on the victim. Now, serious effect is a difficult one to prove. And this is why we call this crime invisible in plain sight. So it may not be how the perpetrator is behaving that is the problem, it is how it is affecting the victim. And so we must look at how the victim's life has changed since that controlling behaviour has started. Have they given up their job? Do they no longer have friends? Do they no longer leave the house? Have they stopped washing and keeping themselves clean? Have they got developing mental health issues or even physical health issues because of the controlling behaviour? And then finally, the perpetrator knows or ought to know that the behaviour will have a serious effect. This is not something that's an accident. This is purposeful, premeditated and planned behaviour that's happening. So to look at this in more of a layman's terms, Professor Evan Stark, is a proponent for coercive control and was very influential in pushing the new law through in England and Wales. And he has written this book, Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. It's a very big book, but very short paraphrasing of the book is that coercive control is not about a fight. So we often hear professionals say, oh, they have fights, they argue. A victim of domestic abuse is not allowed to argue. They don't have an opinion. They are pushed down and down and down until they don't really have a sense of self. So they don't fight. It's not a mutual fight. Professor Stark also talks about patterns of behaviour. So the behaviour of the perpetrator is very much delivered in patterns, and the victim comes to understand what's coming next, and it's kind of a cyclical, and that's where we get the cycle of abuse from. Within practitioners, we talk about cycle of abuse where there's an incident and then a period of calm, and in between that there's like an apology, although not all abusers apologize, and that the abuse is very cyclical, and in some relationships that cycle is happening a couple of times or 3 or 4 times an hour. Sometimes it's the incident happens and then the apology and then it's calm over a few days. But that's what Evan Stark is talking about, is that these behavior patterns that the victim starts to become very aware of. An example that he gives within the book is a female runner who, very successful runner, who at the end of each of her races, if her husband was angry at her for having too much attention for winning a race, or there's too many fans around, would give her her jumper. And the first time he gave it to her, she didn't put it on, and so when they got home he beat her. And so then she learnt that if he gives her the jumper, she's to put it on. And actually it's not about the jumper and her putting the jumper on, it's about him exerting control over her, because it doesn't matter how good she is at running and athletics, and doesn't matter how many people are there to cheer her on, he is in charge of her. The outside world would not have recognised that as anything at all. That's just her husband holding the jumper and passing it to his wife after her race. And so what happens after a long time of this patterns of behaviour and controlling behaviour and undercurrents of violence is that the victim's liberty becomes removed, and they stop thinking for themselves, and they become they have very little autonomy to be able to think for themselves, and they take on the thoughts and the feelings of the abuser. And Evan Stark talks about this as if it's intimate terrorism. And he says within the book at page 15 that domestic violence and abuse, coercive control specifically, is a course of conduct that subordinates women to an alien will by violating their physical integrity, denying them respect and autonomy, depriving them of connectedness, and appropriating or denying them access to resources required for personhood and citizenship. So their personal integrity is violated by violence. They're intimidated often, so they don't have any respect within the relationship, and they begin to not respect themselves, and therefore stop thinking for themselves. They think that we speak to women who say that they feel that they've gone crazy, that they can't be trusted with their children because they're crazy, and actually this is their husband's voice telling them that they're crazy. And depriving them of connectedness is taking them away from their family, and to carry on with that mental health theme, the perpetrator will tell the family members that the victim is crazy, and it's best to leave her for now because she's having a moment. And then he will also tell the victim that their family don't trust them, and their family think that they're that they don't want to be around their victim anymore, and that they don't want to be, they don't trust them, and they don't want to be around them because of the mental health issues, therefore removing the victim from connection with people that may say, actually, there's nothing wrong with your mental health. The behaviours that you're exhibiting are a direct response to the trauma that you've been put under because of this violence and abuse that you're receiving from your partner. Another academic, Julia Tolmie, in 2018 said that the perpetrator may simply look like an old-fashioned man, one who expects certain standards in his home and in relation to his children. Women's roles as wives and mothers involve a measure of unpaid servitude, even in otherwise egalitarian relationships, and this can make women's oppression hard to see. So this is obviously very gendered in what Julia Tolmie is saying. But this is one of the reasons why domestic abuse is more prevalent in heterosexual female with the male to female relationships. Although there are lots of issues around domestic abuse within other relationships, the simple fact that often women are tethered to the home, sometimes, often through their own choice to be a housewife or to stay at home and bring up their children. They've chosen to do so. Their husband supports in that, and that's fantastic. But because that's a model that we see as normal, we wouldn't necessarily question, does that woman want to be at home? Is that partner locking her in the house each day? Is that partner making her lose her job so she has no independence? Is that partner keeping that woman pregnant so that she has no other choices but to keep having his babies? Judith Herman talks about terror, intermittent reward, isolation, and enforced dependency. And she says that these may succeed in creating a submissive and compliant prisoner, but the final step in the psychological control of the victim is not completed until she has been forced to violate her own moral principles and to betray her basic human attachments. So this is where there's a victim of domestic abuse who behaves against how they would normally think they would behave. So they have a moral code that may be not to steal. They may be forced to steal to feed their children because the perpetrator has taken all the money, has left them in the house alone with no food. And often when we see children removed by social care, the mother has been seemingly seen by the outside world to choose to stay with the perpetrator, but the perpetrator has completely brainwashed them into believing they can't live without him around. So I'm going to use some case studies now to explain to you the effects of domestic violence and abuse on victims. So isolation is present in all domestic violence and abuse situations. It is the main thing, the main tool, if you like, that perpetrators use, divide and conquer, as they say. So lack of choices outside of the relationship means that, it's quite obvious, if there's a lack of choice outside the relationship, you stay in the relationship. If there's nobody telling you that there's a better way and supporting you emotionally through these changes that a separation from a perpetrator would need, then you're going to not recognize that there's other choices outside of that relationship. Isolation leads also to a loss of self-identity, as I've already said, and loss of contact with family and friends, as I said, and without our social networks, without our support networks to help us, to give us lifts, places to look after our children while we look for work or we go and pick up welfare benefits, even to have half an hour to yourself, without that, there's very little other choices to be made potentially. And physical isolation can include being locked in the house. And I supported women over the years that were locked in the house. Starts off with the perpetrators potentially accidentally locking them in the house. And then eventually, after the relationship has been going on for quite some time and the perpetrator realizes that the victim isn't going to end that relationship no matter how badly he treats her, because he's completely eroded her sense of self, the locking in the house can become quite obvious. And they say, I've heard perpetrators say, it's for your own good because the world is a scary place and you may get sexually assaulted if you go out, or you may get robbed, and it's better that you stay indoors. But other tactics have included going out with the pushchair, so the victim can't go out because they've got 3 or 4 children, and the double buggy and the pram or whatever, has been taken. I've had a woman whose husband used to take her shoes. She had one pair of shoes and he'd take her shoes, so she can't go out without any shoes on. And yeah, it's more prevalent than you would care to know. Interestingly, linked to COVID, I mean, I couldn't do a whole session without talking about COVID, could I? Suddenly a lot of people realised what it was like potentially to be a victim of domestic abuse, and actually the awareness of domestic abuse has gone through the roof, and government are talking about it more and people are talking about it more because they've suddenly realised that not being able to go out the house and being stuck inside, even if you have a really good relationship with your partner and you're get on with your children, it still were times for everybody where just really wanted to be able to go and see other people. If you can't do that ever, not just because there's a pandemic, but because your partner doesn't allow you to, that completely changes your perception on life, becomes hopeless, and there's very little to look forward to. Financial abuse, so not being allowed to work, but also I have supported women who are made to work. They're the worker in the house and their husband and extended family members all live off of their income, but they also have to do everything else. So they're basically, as we heard earlier, unpaid servitude. I've experienced supporting women whose partners made them lose their jobs, where they'd turn up to work and they'd threaten the boss because they were jealous, thinking that their wife was having affairs at work. I supported a woman whose husband logged onto her laptop in the middle of the night and saw files for private files and reported to her boss that she wasn't locking her files down properly. She lost her job. She was the main breadwinner. And I've also seen so many women with debts that have been run up in their names, welfare benefits being taken from them, and also being thrown out of the home by perpetrators, so they become homeless, and then the perpetrator takes them back and is like the knight in shining armour. And often we see abusers put their names on the mortgage only or on the rent, on the tenancy only, and say things like, I want to take away the burden from you to have to worry about that. So I'll just put my name on there. Often, obviously, the victim then feels they have a lack of choices to be able to move to a new property or to do anything really, because they don't even have a house in their name. So emotional abuse. This is prevalent, and I'd say present in every single abusive a relationship with an abuser, but it's really difficult to see, and it's a really difficult one to evidence, and it's actually emotional abuse is what coercive control law bases itself upon. And the term gaslighting was first used, I think, around 1940 in a film, but that's started to be used quite a bit more now. It's around making somebody have to second guess everything, planting seeds of doubt in their heads constantly, telling them that their mother or their sister or their friend has been talking behind their backs, to make them not want to be friends or connect with their family and friends and isolate them. Also, emotional abuse can actually be even more of an extreme, and I supported a woman whose husband would leave booby traps around the house, one of which was pouring oil onto their stairs, which was an uncarpeted stairs, and then calling her downstairs, and she'd run downstairs, come really quick, because the first time she didn't come quick enough, he beat her up, and so she'd run down the stairs, and on one occasion she fell down the stairs and broke her arm because of the oil, and he just stood over her laughing. Emotional abuse can also include things like sleep deprivation. So another woman I supported would be woken up with boiling water being thrown upon her at night. So she was scared to sleep. So she was sleep deprived and then had to go to work, as she was also the main breadwinner in the home. All of that leads to a lack of self-esteem, second guessing. I had another woman that I supported whose husband used to move her car of an evening while she was asleep at night time, and she'd come down the stairs and go to get in her car, and it'd be in a different place every day. And she thought she was literally going mad because she thought her car, kept forgetting where her car was. Which is why this is a situation where the perpetrator knows or ought to know that the behaviour is going to cause that harm. That's not an accident. That takes a lot of effort to do that. Dependency on the abuser. So of course, in a relationship, regardless of whether it's abusive or not, if you have children, there is an element of dependency upon one another, especially dependent on the person who brings the money into the home. But further dependencies are encouraged by the abuser. Often abusers, when they realise that their victim and their partner has decided that they're maybe going to start moving on, and they want to have a life free from abuse, suddenly family members are moved in, disabled family members, elderly family members. Not only does the victim have to then look after them, but also that's a really good set of spies there telling the abuser where their victim's been each day. And this again can take more of an extreme turn. I supported a woman whose partner encouraged her to use drugs and got her addicted to heroin, and he was the only person who was allowed to inject her. I think that's like the most extreme case I've ever seen of encouraged dependency. So he would leave her in the house all day and she'd be withdrawing, and so she'd be getting very physical symptoms to the withdrawal, and he would then turn up and inject her with heroin. So she had a dependency on the heroin, but a dependency on him to give it to her, and he told all of his friends and everybody around them that there was no way anybody else was allowed to give her the drugs. Enforced pregnancies. So many women tell us that they are raped by their partners. Again, this is where gender comes into it. In terms of male victims, female perpetrators can use sex in a way to control. It's usually with withholding or belittling the perpetrator. It's not at the level that men will use, and we see this all the time. This is from experience that of supporting women that have been raped in front of their children, and enforced pregnancies where the partner knows that their victim is going to become pregnant, and then maybe enforces them to have an abortion. And we've supported women who have had so many abortions that their mental well-being and their physical well-being is just in tatters. They've also raped during pregnancy to the point where they miscarry. One such case around enforced pregnancies was a young girl I supported. She was about 24, and she was on her fifth child, just having her fifth child. She'd had a set of twins in that time, so four pregnancies. And those of you who've heard me speak before would have heard me talk about this before, because it is very pertinent to this matter. I was at a core group with her, supporting her, and her social worker and health visitor were there, and they were wondering how bad the perpetrator could really be, because she keeps getting pregnant by him, as if it was all her. And so I said, why don't we ask her why she keeps getting pregnant? And she said, well, every time I have an appointment with a doctor, so after I finish breastfeeding, I'm ready to then go onto a contraceptive, and every time I have an appointment with the doctor, he cancels it and or locks me in the house, or all of the things I've already spoken about earlier, actually, and then he rapes her. So that's why she was having all these babies. It's not through choice. After she told them that, they changed their tact of how they supported her, and actually really helped her to remove herself from that relationship. And last I heard, she was doing really well. But that's quite a stark example of how enforced pregnancies can be used to control. And then obviously physical abuse. So often the perpetrators only really need to be very physically violent at the beginning of the relationship, because after that it becomes about the threats that will happen again. And veiled threats. We see perpetrators that have weapons on their walls, and baseball bats in the house, and they just have to look at it or pick it up and make that suggestion that that's what's going to happen. One thing we do know for sure is that the risk of physical violence and death escalates massively upon separation. So often we see professionals urge women or people regardless of their gender at the end of to end their relationship, and social workers particularly very much like this is the main way of protecting you, is you need to separate, otherwise we're going to be coercively asking you to do that. And actually separation isn't necessarily the way to become safe. Eventually yes, but it has to be done in a safe and managed way, because many deaths that occur are following separation, and that's because the perpetrators lost complete control and they escalate their behaviour. And it's often this case of, if I can't have you, then nobody will have you. So the effects of domestic violence and abuse on victims is that coercive control erodes the victim's sense of self. As Evan Stark says, it's a course of conduct that subordinates women to an alien will, so the alien being the perpetrator, and it takes away, completely negates their autonomy. So how do we help victims of domestic abuse? What do we do if somebody tells us that they think that their partner is controlling them, they're in fear of them, there's been violence, etc.? Now, I would say to you that the first thing you could do is show them the way to the one-stop shop in their local area. So one-stop shops are every week, usually in each district. So you've actually got 2 in Canterbury. There's one in Medway, and they are generally they're weekly, and they're usually 2 hours a week. And these all have to run in a certain way. There are protocols throughout the county so that you know what you're going to get wherever you go. And that is that certain professionals are going to be there. The police will be there. There should be a solicitor. There'll be benefit advisors. There'll definitely be at least one domestic abuse specialist, usually 2. They'll have housing usually there, someone there to advise around children. The idea being that it's all under one roof, a one-stop shop. I'm going to do a very quick case study in a moment to show you how exactly a one-stop shop would work and lead to lots of support. So another person who's usually at the one-stop shop is an IDVAS. This is an independent domestic violence advisor. They are within the Kent and Medway community. We've had an injection of funding from the MOJ, Ministry of Justice, following the COVID pandemic. And so now Kent and Medway's IDVA services are have been extended quite a bit. So they sit within the hospitals now, as well as in the community. They sit at the multi-agency risk assessment conferences. They sit within a MASH, which is a multi-agency safeguarding hub, which is where social workers and police also sit. There are young people's advisors, IDVAs. There are specialist IDVAs for people that are hard of hearing, LGBT IDVAs, and also male IDVAs. As I said earlier, if you want to find out what services there are in your area, if you go onto this website, so it just put in Domestic Abuse Services Kent, and it will come up. There's a map that shows you what services are in each of the areas across Kent and Medway. We'll show the one-stop shops, the IDVAs, and also all the other services, because there's group provision, there's one-to-one provision, there's counselling services, there's an awful lot of stuff going on out in the community. So as I said, I'm going to do a very quick case study now, just to help for people to understand all the services that are available, but also just how intricate the support is needed to help somebody fleeing domestic abuse. So Anne went to her GP and she disclosed to her GP that her partner was abusive. Her GP was well trained and had had lots of training and understood that he needed to do something about this rather than just recording it and leaving it. And they had leaflets for the one-stop shop, gave one to Anne, and Anne took herself along to the one-stop shop. Once she got there, she spoke to a solicitor who gave her legal advice around separating from her partner and also obtaining a order to protect her. There was also someone there from housing who advised her around what housing provision she would be entitled to apply for and any support that she could access for private rented accommodation. And they passed her also at the One Stop Shop onto an IDVA. The IDVA did a risk assessment, assessed the Anne as being high risk of death or serious injury, and referred her to the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, which is the MARAC. From the MARAC, linked in with the police because she hadn't reported any of the incidents to the police. The police interviewed Anne and arrested the ex-partner. He was then charged with assaulting her. Also, the IDVA made a referral for child protection because Anne's children had been present during the abuse, and the continuing stalking and harassment from the ex-partner was affecting the children. And then off the back of the child protection referral, Anne received enhanced support from her health visitor, and also the school were able to offer counselling to the children. The child protection and the MARAC processes work closely together, so Anne doesn't have to tell her story lots of times. And also Anne was supported through the family courts by a specialist IDVA, because the ex-partner decided he wanted to gain custody of the children, and she was helped through the court process to stop that from happening. And that was all from Anne going to her GP and disclosing domestic abuse. Hopefully this has given you an idea of the behaviours and the effects of domestic abuse on victims, but also more importantly, helped you to understand how you can signpost somebody to either a one-stop shop or the other services that are available on the link, which I will go back to now. If you take the details of this link, and I will also share these slides so that you can have these slides as well. So that link will give you all of the services that are available in Kent and Medway, should you need them for anything. I hope you have a great rest of the day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for listening to me.
Right, thank you all for being patient. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, bring us back, and turn my camera back on. So hopefully you'll see me again. There we are. So we're going to go back into some breakout rooms again. If you've got any questions, I know there was a question about some London, because Lisa spent quite a long time signposting to Medway and Canterbury. I think somebody did actually post a link for the London IDVA. Greg might have a bit more. Greg, have you got? Yeah.
Yes, and apologies, it's really difficult to cover all the services, and especially domestic abuse varies from locale to locale because of the variety of commission services. We will be hopefully holding later this year a face-to-face event, as we have done in the previous with local agencies, so police, local domestic abuse agencies, to cover some of that. And as I said, part of we are developing a sort of up-to-date list of local services as well. So thanks, Sarah. When you go into the breakout rooms, could you think about, and again, we won't be asking feedback, but just perhaps you can give back in some of the chat, has the talk made a difference? On a scale 1 to 5, 5 being the top, has it increased your awareness? It was deliberately generic, but also can you think about what is the impact in church communities? What is the difference about church? And one of the biggest issues, I'll give a little clue, is of course, and it is often a challenge, as Bishop Rose was saying earlier, is about the sanctity of marriage and the added complexity of abuse within a church context, and the misuse of the Bible about, well, you've got to remain in this, and actually, you can't leave. Divorce is not an option. So just for a consideration. So Fiona is going to do her magic and throw you into a room or two, and we look forward to hearing any feedback from the discussions.
Thank you. Welcome back. I know some of you, the rooms are closing in the next 60 seconds. So if you can remember to mute yourself on the way back in, that would be really helpful. Shortly be handing over to Andy for our closing remarks. But if you wanted to, I hope the discussions in your breakout rooms were interesting and helpful. Feel free to, if you want to, pop anything in the chat on your reflections, or if you've got any further questions related to what we've heard today, or anything related to safeguarding. I must add, don't put a random question in there. I'm not sure any of us are prepared for that. But if you've got any safeguarding questions, please feel free to pop that in the chat. So I think that's all of us back. So thank you again. Just a quick reminder, I know you come back in from your breakout rooms. If you could mute yourselves, that would be really helpful. And we're just going to hear a few closing remarks from Andy. Again, just any reflections you might want to pop into the chat while Andy's talking would be great. And I'm going to unspotlight myself and hand over to Andy. Oh, you're muted, Andy. You're muted.
I'm fighting the mute button. It's great to see you all. And I want to say a really big thank you to everybody who has contributed to this morning. Thank you to the safeguarding teams from Rochester and Canterbury Diocese. Thank you to Bishop Rose and to Paul and to Lisa. What we've heard this morning has been, I think, really helpful and challenging. But I also want to say thank you to all of you. As Bishop Rose said, intentionally giving up a Saturday morning to be here is a big thing, and I'm really grateful. But I'm grateful too for all that you do. All of you have a proactive role in safeguarding, and whether you do that as clergy, whether you do that as safeguarding officers, whether you do it in some other way, thank you for what you do proactively. Thank you for what you have to do reactively. Sometimes those reactive moments are not the ones you want, but thank you for reacting and being there. And I'm really conscious that for all of you, for all of us, this is both a doing role and a being role. There are things that we do and there are things that we are as we reflect this culture of good safeguarding, of great safeguarding. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you that by being here this morning, you've added to what you do. Just as we close, I wanted just to reflect for a moment on a Bible passage which I hope will help us as we go out into the rest of today and continue the ministry that we're part of. You'll remember the miracle of the man who was lowered through the roof to encounter Jesus. And that story is graphic. It's a great Sunday school story because there's so much drama in the story as the friends try to get their paralyzed friend to Jesus through the crowds and eventually give up trying to push through the crowds and lower him through the roof. And I guess for us in our roles, there are some bits of that story which relate to us and which are just worth reflecting on for a moment. Bishop Rose mentioned in her address that Jesus is the one who brings life in its abundance, or life in its fullness. And the challenge for those bringing their paralyzed friend was to get him to Jesus, who would bring that abundant life. And faced with the challenges, there were so many things they might have done. They might have just said, this is all too difficult. Let's try it on another day when it's easier. Let's just kind of park this and we'll go home and maybe we'll come back to it. They may have been really conscious of the people who were in the way and just going, actually, we can't get through, we can't get around these people. It's all too difficult. it was messy. Once they got onto the roof and decided the closest way to Jesus was through the roof, it was messy. Whatever they had to do to make the hole in the roof was going to be messy. It was certainly messy for those who were underneath and who encountered the ceiling coming down around them. And there's a sense in which that structure also got in the way. And yet with all those challenges, with all the reasons they could have given up and gone somewhere else, done something else, found Jesus in a different way, they pushed through, they persevered, they were intentional in getting their friend to Jesus. And we see something of the value of perseverance in this story. And I guess what I want to say to you this morning as we close is there'll be moments for us in the things that we deal with in safeguarding where we feel like, can I just park this and do it another day? There are moments when it will feel that what people say, what people feel will get in the way of what we know is right. I want to encourage us to persevere. There'll be times when what we're faced with will feel messy. I want to encourage you to persevere. There'll be times when structures, not necessarily the roofs of buildings, feel like they get in the way. And I want to encourage you to persevere. Sometimes our journey will be first via those who are experts, those who will help us, those who will advise us, whether that's Diocese safeguarding advisors or others. And I want to say, push through to make those encounters and make them real. But ultimately, our hope, our prayer is that those we advocate for, those we support, those we're there for, will find Jesus who brings life in its abundance. Thank you for persevering. Thank you for pushing through. Thank you for being part of a very real ministry in the lives of our churches. And in your roles, you minister, and I want to thank you for that. May I pray? I'm going to use one of the prayers that comes from the safeguarding prayers produced by the Church of England. May the doors of our churches be wide enough to receive all who come seeking God and fellowship. May the doors of our churches be narrow enough to shut out pettiness and pride, envy and enmity. May the thresholds of our churches be no stumbling block to young or to frail feet. May our churches be for all who enter, safe places and doorways to a richer life in Christ. And may each of us, as we have received this morning, know the presence and the peace of God now and always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Andy. So thank you, everyone. That is the end of our safeguarding conference for this morning. And look at that, we've given you the gift of time again this year, 15 extra minutes on your morning. Again, thank you all for making the commitment to be here this morning. It's been really insightful and engaging, and I've enjoyed watching the chat and some of your questions and queries and answering some of those. If you do have anything that you're concerned about that's arisen out of this morning, either personally or a situation you've come across, please contact your relevant DSA. So Rochester, obviously that's Greg and Caroline, or in Canterbury, that's myself and Paul. Again, if you've got any DBS questions, if you can contact Caroline Evans, and in Rochester, that would be Caroline or Alison. And if you've got any training queries, if you contact Katie Harper in Canterbury, that's our trainer, and Greg, I'm assuming that might be yourself, and Caroline in Rochester. So again, all I need to say is thank you very much. The team are going to stay online for a few minutes afterwards. So if you can all leave, and if not, I'll give you a few seconds and then I'll just throw you out. So thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you either at a face-to-face conference for domestic abuse later on in this year or next